The first time Virginia Aldridge sat on Owen Talbot's fence rail, she did not ask permission, and he did not give it. He simply watched her from the shadowed doorway of his barn and said nothing at all, because saying nothing had become the language he spoke most fluently. It was the autumn of 1874, in the flat, sun-bitten stretch of western Texas, where the town of Caldera sat like a dried seed between two limestone ridges, and the wind came down from the north in October carrying the smell of change, of something arriving that had not yet announced itself. The land out here did not apologize for its severity. The grass grew in pale yellow clumps between red dirt and shale. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed had already gone gold and were losing their leaves in slow spirals. And the sky at evening turned colors that a painter back east might have called impossible amber bleeding into violet bleeding into a deep, bruised indigo that settled over everything like a held breath. Owen Talbot's property sat at the western edge of Caldera's loose scatter of homesteads, 140 acres of decent grazing land he had worked alone for 3 years following the death of his wife, Clara, who had been taken by a fever in the summer of 1871, when she was 26 years old and he was 28. He had not recovered from it in any way that he would have called recovery. He had continued. There was a difference between those two things that he understood with the specific precision of a man who had measured the distance between them with his own 2 hands every single day for 3 years. He kept 15 head of cattle, a good quarter horse named Drum, 2 mules he called Monday and Tuesday because he had never been imaginative about mule names, a stand of kitchen garden that Clara had started and that he maintained out of a stubbornness he could not fully explain, and a farmhouse with 2 rooms and a porch that faced east so he could see the morning come in. The fence that bordered the north side of his property ran parallel to the road that connected Caldera to the next settlement of any size, a town called Holt Fork about 12 miles east. It was a good fence, cedar posts and 4 lines of wire, solid and unshowy, the way Owen Talbot liked most things to be. Virginia Aldridge had arrived in Caldera in September of 1874 on the eastbound stage from El Paso, which was to say she had come from the west, which struck most people in town as unusual. Most newcomers came from the east, heading toward some imagined frontier opportunity, carrying their trunk and their hope and their particular brand of hard-headed naivete. Virginia had come from the wrong direction, or so people said, meaning she had come from somewhere already used up, already failed. She was 23 years old, dark-haired, with green eyes that had a directness in them that some of the women in town found unsettling and most of the men found arresting. She was not fragile-looking, but she was not coarse either. She had the look of someone who had done hard things without becoming hard herself, which was a distinction worth making. She had taken a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Callie Pruitt, which cost her 40 cents a week including 2 meals a day, and she had almost immediately secured work as a seamstress for the dry goods store owned by a Mr. Amos Briggs, who sold fabric and thread and buttons, and had previously been sending his more complicated mending work to Holt Fork on the stage. Virginia's stitches were small and even, and she worked quickly without hurrying, and Amos Briggs had hired her on the spot with a satisfaction that bordered on relief. She had not explained to anyone in Caldera why she had left El Paso, and no one had pressed her with any particular boldness, because there was an unspoken understanding in frontier towns that a person's past was their own property until they chose to deed it over. What people did know, because Virginia did not lie about it, was that she had no family left to speak of. Her father had died of a heart ailment 2 years prior, her mother had died when Virginia was 12, and she had a brother named Samuel who had gone north to Kansas and stopped writing letters somewhere around 1872. She was, in the most literal sense, alone in the world, and managing it with a kind of practical grace that Mrs. Prout found admirable and a little heartbreaking in equal measure. It was Mrs. Prout who had inadvertently introduced Virginia to the existence of Owen Talbot. Not by introduction, exactly. More by the particular way frontier women convey information, which is to say by speaking around a subject in careful circles until the shape of it becomes clear. "There is a man at the far western edge of town," Mrs. Prout had said one evening in late September, pouring coffee at her kitchen table, "who lost his wife 3 years ago and has not properly joined the living since. He comes into town for supplies on Thursdays, and he speaks exactly as many words as he requires, and not one more, and he has the saddest eyes I have ever seen on a man who is otherwise entirely intact." Virginia had listened to this and said nothing in response, because she had not known what to say, and also because she understood the particular weight of the kind of grief Mrs. Prout was describing. But she had noticed him the following Thursday, because small towns in 1874 did not have many places to be unnoticed, and Owen Talbot was the kind of man who occupied space with a quietness that somehow made him more visible rather than less. He was tall and lean with dark hair that had gone gray at the temples in a way that looked less like age and more like weather. He had a jaw that could have been cut with a straight rule and hands that were large and work-scarred in ways that spoke of real labor, not performance. He moved slowly but with complete economy, no wasted gesture, no unnecessary word, loading his supplies into the wagon bed with the calm deliberateness of someone who had done exactly this for years and saw no reason to modify the process. He had not looked at Virginia, and she had not spoken to him, and that had been entirely unremarkable. And yet something about him had lodged itself in her thinking in a way she did not fully understand and did not try to examine too closely. What she had done, the following week, was take her evening walk west along the road instead of east, which was the direction she usually walked because it led toward the creek and the cottonwood trees and was more pleasant by most measures. The western road was straight and flat and not particularly scenic, and it ended more or less at Owen Talbot's property line, and Virginia had told herself she was simply varying her route, which was something she believed for approximately 2 evenings before she stopped lying to herself about it. The fence ran east to west along the north edge of his property, and there was one section of it, about a quarter mile from the road junction, where the top rail ran across a natural rise in the land that made it roughly the right height for sitting if one were inclined to sit on fence rails, which Virginia Aldridge turned out to be, or at least which she became on the first evening she tried it. She had sat down, settled her skirts, and looked out over the field where Owen Talbot's cattle grazed in the long golden light of an October evening, and she had felt, for the first time since arriving in Caldera, something that was not quite contentment but was adjacent to it. A quality of stillness that the town itself, small as it was, could not quite provide. She had not seen Owen Talbot that first evening. She had simply sat for half an hour as the sun went down and the light turned amber and the cattle made their slow, contented progress across the field, and then she had walked back to Mrs. Prout's boarding house and eaten her supper and gone to bed, and slept better than she had in weeks. The second evening she sat again on the rail, and this time she did see Owen Talbot, or rather she saw the shadow of him in the barn doorway, which faced north and would have given him a clear view of her if he had been looking, which the stillness of his shadow suggested he was. He stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, and Virginia sat on the rail and watched the cattle, and then he moved back into the barn, and she heard the sounds of him working, the scrape of metal on wood, the low murmur of him speaking to his horse, and she had felt no alarm at his presence, and apparently he had felt no alarm at hers, or at least had decided that alarm was more trouble than it was worth. He did not come out. He did not call to her. He did not tell her she was on his fence or near his property or that she was unwelcome. She came back the next evening and the next, and the pattern established itself with the ease of something that had always been true and was only now being discovered. Through all of October, she came to the fence rail in the evenings, and Owen Talbot continued his work in his barn or his yard or his field, and occasionally she would see him moving through his property with the deliberate calm of a man who had organized his life down to its smallest necessary detail. And he would occasionally look toward her, and she would occasionally look toward him, and they would both look away again. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way that silences usually become when two people are both aware of them. It was, Virginia thought, the strangest and most companionable silence she had ever been part of. The first words Owen Talbot spoke to her came on the 3rd of November, which was a Tuesday, cool and clear with a light wind from the northwest, and a sunset that was particularly magnificent in an undemonstrative way, all rust and gold, with none of the purple dramatics that came in summer. Virginia had been sitting on the rail for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard boots on ground coming toward her, and then Owen Talbot was leaning against the fence post nearest to her, not quite facing her, looking out at the field in the same direction she was, and he said without preamble or greeting, "Cattle do not need watching." Virginia considered this. "I am not watching the cattle," she said. He looked at her then, a full look, direct and unguarded in a way she had not expected. His eyes, she thought, were exactly as Mrs. Pruitt had described them, not sad in any performative sense, sad in the way that land gets sad after a long drought fundamentally altered, bearing the memory of it in every surface. "What are you watching then?" he asked. "The light," she said. "The way it comes across the field in the evening. It is very particular to this spot." He looked back at the field. "I had not noticed," he said, which was either a statement of fact or something else, she was not sure. "You are out here in it every day," Virginia said. "I suppose things you are in the middle of are harder to see than things you are looking at from a distance." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass at the base of the fence posts with a dry sound. One of the cattle made a low, unconcerned noise somewhere in the middle distance. "I am Owen Talbot," he said. "I know," she said. "I am Virginia Aldridge." "I know," he said, and that was the first conversation. It lasted perhaps 4 minutes, and covered nothing in particular, and Virginia walked back to town with the feeling of something in her chest that was both lighter and more serious than anything she had felt in a long time. She came back the next evening, and he was not outside. She came back the evening after that, and he was in the field mending a section of interior fence line, and he looked up when she took her place on the rail, and he nodded once, and she nodded back, and that was sufficient. The conversations began to lengthen by degrees so small that neither of them could have said when the change had happened, only that it had. He would come to lean against the post, or sometimes to sit on the fence rail a few feet away from her, and they would talk about small, particular things. The weather, which was a serious subject in this part of Texas and not small talk at all. The condition of the cattle. The quality of the grass this year compared to other years. The fact that the creek had gone down 3 inches since the last rain, which had been 3 weeks ago, and whether it was likely to rain before December. Virginia asked about his kitchen garden, because she had seen the late-season remnants of it from the road, and recognized the careful arrangement of someone who knew what they were doing. And Owen Talbot had talked about the garden with a specificity and a quiet pride that told her something important about him without either of them naming it. "My wife planted it," he said, on one of those November evenings, in the same tone in which he said most things, direct and undecorated. "I have kept it going." "That is a kind thing to do," Virginia said. He considered this for a moment. "It is a productive thing to do," he said, with a slight correction that she understood was not a dismissal of the sentiment but rather his own discomfort with accepting it. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive," she said. He looked at her with a slightly different quality of attention than he usually brought to bear, something that was almost but not quite surprised, and then looked back at the field. "No," he agreed, "they are not." She did not push further, and he did not offer further, and the subject of Clara lay between them with the weight of something real and respected, not ignored and not dwelt upon, simply acknowledged. Virginia understood this particular balance because she had her own griefs that she carried in the same way, and she thought that grief, when it is handled honestly, recognizes itself in others the way animals recognize their own kind, quietly and without ceremony. December came, and with it the first real cold, the kind that had teeth in it, the kind that made the shortening days feel even shorter than they were. Virginia had begun bringing a heavier shawl to the fence rail in the evenings, and on some evenings the cold was such that she could see her breath, small white clouds, and she stayed anyway, because the view of the field in the last light of the afternoon had become something she would not willingly give up, and also because Owen Talbot had begun to bring coffee. It had started without announcement on the 7th of December. He had appeared at the fence post with 2 tin cups and extended one to her without speaking, and she had taken it without speaking, and they had drunk their coffee and watched the sky turn orange, and then dark red and then purple, and the warmth of the cup in her cold hands was one of the best sensations she could remember. He had done it again the next evening, and the next, and it had become part of the pattern without anyone having decided to make it so. "You do not have to do this," Virginia said one evening, meaning the coffee. "I make it for myself," he said. "There is always too much." She understood that this was not the full truth, or rather that it was a version of the truth that he was more comfortable with than the fuller version, and she let it stand. What she was beginning to understand about Owen Talbot, in these weeks of slow accumulation, was that he was not a cold man or an unfeeling man or a man who had become hard from hardship. He was a man who had loved something deeply and lost it and had responded by becoming very careful, very controlled, very exact. He had not shut himself off from feeling, she thought. He had simply stopped allowing it free movement, the way you stop a creek from flooding by building a careful dam which keeps the water contained and useful but changes the nature of it. The water is still water. It is still moving. It has just been redirected. She was also beginning to understand that she was, without having planned it or consciously said about it, falling in love with him, and that this was both alarming and inevitable in the way that most things that are truly meant seem both alarming and inevitable when you see them clearly. She had not come to Caldera looking for love. She had come looking for work, for a place to be that was not El Paso, for a life that was manageable and self-sustaining, and not dependent on anyone else's continuing presence, because everyone whose continuing presence she had depended upon had at some point ceased to continue. She was not bitter about this exactly, but she had made her practical arrangements accordingly, and falling in love with a quiet, closed-off widower who leaned against fence posts and said very little and brought her coffee as a way of not having to say certain things out loud was not among the arrangements she had made. And yet there it was. The trouble, or not the trouble exactly, but the complication was that she could not tell what Owen Talbot felt in return, if anything. He came to the fence every evening she was there. He brought the coffee. The conversations had grown from 4 minutes to 30, and from practicalities to something with more texture and more depth, the kind of conversation that happens between people who have begun to pay careful attention to each other without having said so explicitly. He had asked about her life before Caldera, carefully, in the manner of someone who understands the territory they are asking about may have uncertain footing. She had told him about her father, about El Paso, about learning to sew from her mother before her mother died, about Samuel's letters that had stopped, about the specific particular quality of loneliness that is different from solitude, and he had listened to all of it with the full attention of a man who understood most of it from the inside. But he had not touched her hand. He had not said anything that could not have been said by a considerate neighbor to a harmless trespasser on his fence. He had offered her nothing beyond coffee and conversation, and the quiet evidence of his continued willingness to be present, which was not nothing. Virginia knew it was not nothing, but was also not enough to build certainty upon. It was in late December, 3 days before Christmas, that the first real crisis came, and it had nothing to do with Owen Talbot's feelings and everything to do with the more immediate problems of the world. Virginia had been walking to the fence rail in the early evening when she had heard shouting from the direction of the main road, and had turned to see two riders pushing their horses hard down the road from the east, heading toward the center of Caldera, and the note of urgency in their riding was unmistakable. She had not gone to the fence that evening. She had turned around and followed the sound back into town, because something in the quality of the shouting required attention. The news was that a fire had broken out at the livery stable on the eastern end of Caldera, and it had already caught the roof of the adjacent building, which was a dry goods warehouse belonging to a man named Hector Voss, and the volunteer firefighting arrangements that Caldera possessed, which were informal and limited, were struggling to keep ahead of it. Virginia had arrived at the scene to find perhaps 30 people already forming a bucket line from the water trough, and she had taken her place in the line without being asked, because that was what you did, and had worked for 2 hours until her arms ached, and her dress was ruined with water and ash, and she smelled like smoke from her hair to her boots. Owen Talbot was already there when she arrived. He was at the front of the bucket line, nearest the fire, taking full buckets from the line and throwing them with a controlled efficiency that suggested he had done this before. He was working beside a man Virginia did not recognize, a heavy-set man with a red beard who was throwing buckets with less efficiency but equal determination. Owen had not looked around when she arrived at the line, and she had not called out to him, and they had simply both worked until the fire was out. The livery stable was a total loss. Hector Voss's warehouse had lost most of one wall, but the main structure had been saved. 2 horses had been gotten out of the stable before the roof fell in, but 3 others had not, and the sound those horses had made was something Virginia did not want to carry with her but knew she would. The stableman, a young man named Pete Calhoun, had burns on his hands and forearms from the initial attempt to get the horses out, and Dr. Whitmore, who practiced out of a room above the barber's shop, had been called to attend to him. Virginia was standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the last of the embers being doused, when Owen Talbot appeared beside her. He was covered in ash and soot, and there was a burn mark on the forearm of his shirt that had not, apparently, gotten through to the skin beneath, and he smelled strongly of smoke. He looked at Virginia with an expression that was a little different from his usual, something loosened in it, something slightly undone by the last 2 hours in the way that emergencies undo people. "You are not hurt," he said, and it was not entirely a question. "No," she said. "Are you?" "No," he said. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the smoke rise from the ruins of the livery in the cold December air, and then Owen Talbot said, with a quietness that made it feel more significant rather than less, "You should come back for the fence rail tomorrow. It will be cold, but the light will still be there." Virginia looked at him. He was looking at the ruins of the livery. "I will be there," she said. He nodded once, and then he went to collect his horse and his wagon, and she walked back to Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house, and she felt the particular warmth of those words, "You should come back," all the way to the boarding house door, which was the warmest she had been all evening despite the fire. She was there the next evening. He was there too, at the fence post, with 2 cups of coffee, and they watched the field in the cold, clear light and said little, and it was one of the better evenings she had spent at that fence. Christmas came and went quietly in Caldera. There was a church service that Virginia attended with Mrs. Pruitt, and a small gathering at the Briggs house, to which Virginia had been invited along with several other of the town's single or otherwise unattached residents, and it was pleasant in the way that these things are pleasant when you are well disposed toward the people around you, but not yet fully at home among them. Owen Talbot did not attend the gathering, because Owen Talbot did not attend gatherings, which was known to everyone in Caldera as a fact as established as the direction the wind came from in winter. Virginia had left a small package on his fence rail on the morning of Christmas Day before the service, a small bottle of liniment for the hands that she had made herself from a recipe her mother had given her, useful for cracked and weathered skin in cold weather, packed in a scrap of calico tied with plain string because she did not have ribbon, with a note that said only for the cold months. She had not mentioned it to him when she came to the fence that evening, and he had not mentioned it to her. But the following evening, when he came to the fence post with the coffee, there was something in the way he handed her the cup, a deliberateness, a slight additional care, that told her the package had been received and the intention behind it understood, and that was sufficient. The new year of 1875 arrived in a way that January in West Texas usually arrives, which is to say with wind and cold and a sky of uncompromising gray, and the fence rail evenings became shorter because the light ran out earlier and the cold drove Virginia back to town sooner. But they did not stop entirely. She came 4 evenings out of 7 even through January, and on the evenings she did not come, she noticed an absence in herself that was useful information about the nature of what she was feeling. January also brought trouble of a different sort. A man named Doyle Fitch had been making rounds of the smaller homesteads west of Caldera, presenting himself as the representative of a land company out of Dallas that was interested in purchasing grazing land, and the prices he was offering were below market value in ways that were easy to explain away at first glance, but troubling on closer examination. Several of the smaller homesteaders, those who had come to the territory more recently and had less of a foothold, had sold to him, because when you are scraping by in a hard land and someone offers you cash money, the offer is genuinely difficult to refuse even when you suspect it is not entirely honest. Owen Talbot's land was not among those Fitch had approached, perhaps because Owen's acreage and the condition of his operation made it clear he was not a man likely to be easily pressured. But the news of what Fitch was doing had reached Owen, because news in small towns always reaches everyone eventually, and it had put a tension in him that Virginia noticed in early February when she came to the fence and found him already at the post, leaning against it with a quality in his posture that was different from his usual stillness. "You have heard about the land agent," she said, because it was not a question. "I have," he said. "Mrs. Prout says the Larkin family sold to him last week," Virginia said. "The family with the little children who came from Missouri last spring." "The Larkins were never going to make it on that land," Owen said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat statement of an experienced man's assessment. "Too small, wrong aspect, water rights not properly established." Fitch knew which ones to approach. "It feels dishonest," Virginia said. "It is dishonest," Owen said, with a certainty that had no anger in it but no uncertainty either. "The prices he is offering are 1/3 of what that land is worth. He knows the people he is approaching do not have the legal resources to know otherwise, and he is counting on it." "Is there anything to be done?" Virginia asked. Owen was quiet for a moment. "I am going to talk to Judge Harmon in Holt Fork," he said. "He has jurisdiction in land matters, and he is not a man who can be easily purchased." Virginia looked at him. "You would do that?" He glanced at her with slight surprise, as though the action had not struck him as being particular. "It is the right thing to do," he said. "You said you do not involve yourself in other people's concerns," Virginia said, not accusingly, simply recalling a statement he had made in an earlier conversation about why he did not attend town meetings. "I said I prefer not to," Owen said. "There is a difference." She thought about this for a moment, and about the man it revealed, and felt a shift in herself that was both quiet and significant. It took Owen Talbot 10 days to make the trip to Holt Fork and back, because he could not leave his cattle unattended for multiple days without arrangement, and arranging for the neighboring Jessup boy to come by twice daily to check the stock and fill the water troughs took its own time. He left on a Thursday and returned on a Sunday. And in the days he was gone, Virginia came to the fence rail anyway and sat in the cold February light and looked at the empty field and the quiet farmhouse and felt the full shape of what had happened to her feelings about this man, which was that they had grown past the point where she could manage them with the kind of careful practical distance she had been trying to maintain. She was, thoroughly and without significant reservation, in love with Owen Talbot. She was in love with his quietness and his sadness and his carefully controlled precision, and the way he talked about his cattle and his kitchen garden, and the rare moments when he said something with a wry quality that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. She was in love with the fact that he had ridden 12 miles to talk to a judge about land rights for people he barely knew. She was in love with the coffee and the fence post, and the evenings that had accumulated between them into something she could not name, but would not give back under any circumstances she could imagine. This was, she acknowledged, a somewhat inconvenient realization, because she still did not know what Owen Talbot felt about her, and the gap between feeling something with full conviction and knowing whether it was returned was one of the more uncomfortable places a person can find themselves. Owen returned from Holt Fork on a Sunday afternoon, and Virginia happened to be walking west along the road when his wagon came in from the east, and they met at more or less the exact point where her walk usually ended. He pulled Drum to a stop and looked down at her from the wagon seat with an expression that she had learned by this point to read with some accuracy. He was tired but satisfied, which on Owen's face looked only marginally different from tired but resigned, but she knew the difference. "Judge Harmon is sympathetic," he said. "He will be coming to Caldera next month to review the transaction records. Fitch's prices were low enough that there may be grounds for a fraud claim." "That is very good news," Virginia said. "It may not come to anything," he said, with the careful qualification of a man who had learned not to overinvest in outcomes he could not control. "But it may," she said. "It may," he agreed. There was a pause in which he looked at her from the wagon seat and she looked up at him, and the light was very clear and clean, the way February light in Texas is sometimes clean, cutting, and honest, and Owen Talbot said, "I found myself thinking, while I was in Holt Fork, that I would tell you about it when I returned." Virginia absorbed this. "Did you?" she said, not as a question. "I had not thought about telling someone something," he said, choosing his words with the care he always chose his words with, but with a slight roughness in his voice that was new, "in a longer time than I can accurately account for." She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead, at Drum's ears, at nothing in particular. His hands were easy on the reins, but the set of his jaw was not easy at all, and she understood that he was saying something large in the smallest available language, and that he was not certain what she would do with it. "I found myself," Virginia said, meeting his language with the same care, "looking at your empty field while you were gone and noticing that it was not the field I had been coming to see." Now he looked at her. The full, direct, unguarded look she had first seen on the November evening, when she had said that things you are in the middle of are harder to see than things you see from a distance. "Virginia," he said. "Owen," she said. And that was, on a Sunday afternoon in February 1875 on a flat road in West Texas, both the end of one thing and the beginning of another, or rather the moment when what had been growing quietly and without announcement for 4 months finally broke the surface and became visible. He drove the wagon onto his property and put up drum and saw to the cattle, and Virginia walked back to town, and neither of them had made any declaration or any promise, but both of them knew something had changed, had officially changed, in a way that did not require further language to be real. The week that followed was different in the way that everything is different once you know what you're looking at. Owen came to the fence post the next evening and the evening after that, but the quality of the conversation had shifted. It was easier and more difficult at the same time. Easier because there was now an acknowledged undercurrent that made the small particular talk feel more nourishing. More difficult because the acknowledged undercurrent also made certain silences feel charged in ways they had not been before. On the Wednesday of that week, Owen said, without any particular lead-in, "I would like to show you the garden." Virginia looked at him. "The kitchen garden." "Yes," he said. "There is not much to see this time of year, but I have been planning what I will plant in March, and I would like to—" He paused, and the slight roughness came into his voice again. "I would like to show someone." Virginia understood that this was significant in ways that had nothing to do with kitchen gardens. "I would like to see it," she said. He opened the gate for her, which was the first time she had been on his property rather than at its edge, and the small gesture of the gate swinging open felt like something ceremonial, though they did not acknowledge it as such. The kitchen garden was at the south side of the farmhouse, a well-laid plot of about a quarter-acre with the remnants of last year's plants still in their rows, dried and cleared, but with the beds already turned over and raked, ready for the coming season. He showed her where the tomatoes would go, and the beans, and the kitchen herbs along the south-facing bed, and where Clara had planted sweet peas along the fence for the color of them, because not everything in a garden has to be productive in the literal sense, he said, and Virginia heard in that sentence a small evolution from the conversation they had had in October about the garden being a productive thing rather than merely a kind thing. "Sweet peas," Virginia said. "My mother grew them." "Did she?" he said. "Along a fence very much like this one," Virginia said, touching the rough wood of the garden fence with one finger. She said they were the one thing she would not give up no matter how tight the money ran. Owen was quiet for a moment, looking at the bed where the sweet peas would go. "Clara said something similar," he said. "She said the peas were not negotiable." Virginia smiled. It was the first time she had smiled openly at the mention of Clara, and something in Owen's face shifted slightly when she did, not released exactly, but oriented differently, as though the grief and the present moment had been rearranged in some small productive way. "I think they were both right," Virginia said. "I think they were," Owen agreed. He walked her back to the gate when the light had nearly gone, and at the gate he paused and said, "I would like to ask if you would come to supper on Saturday if that is agreeable to you." Virginia's heart did a thing she was not prepared for. "It is agreeable to me," she said, with a steadiness that she was moderately proud of. 6 o'clock, he said. 6 o'clock, she agreed. She walked back to town in the cold February air, with the fence post's worn wood still warm somehow in her memory. And she went to bed that night thinking about kitchen gardens and sweet peas, and the particular quality of a man's voice, when he is saying something he has not said in a very long time. The supper on Saturday was not elaborate. Owen was not a complicated cook. He had told her plainly when he issued the invitation. And the meal was plain beef stew with good cornbread and dried apple preserves on the side and coffee. And Virginia had brought a small jar of honey from Mrs. Prute's pantry, trading for it with an afternoon's mending, because you do not come to someone's table empty-handed. The farmhouse inside was clean and spare. 2 rooms with the furniture of a man who had equipped himself for function rather than comfort. A table and 2 chairs and a cast-iron stove in the front room, a narrow bed in the back room, a shelf of tools and a shelf of books, which surprised her. "You read," she said, looking at the shelf. "When I can," he said. "In winter there is more time." She examined the titles: a Bible, 2 volumes on cattle husbandry, a geography of Texas, a collection of Shakespeare's plays that looked well used, and a novel she did not recognize. "Shakespeare," she said. "Clara's," he said, "but I have read it more than once." "Which play?" Virginia asked. He considered. "The Winter's Tale," he said, "more than the others." She thought about that, the play of grief and renewal of things lost and remarkably, improbably recovered, and did not say anything, because she did not need to. They ate the stew and the cornbread and talked in the easy, specific way they had been building toward for 4 months. And the farmhouse held the warmth of the stove and the smell of coffee and the particular intimacy of 2 people, at a small table in a small room in a large, dark, cold world, which is one of the most ancient and reliable forms of closeness that exists. After supper, Owen cleared the table and poured the last of the coffee and sat back down, and after a moment he said, "I want to say something that I have been working out how to say." Virginia set down her cup and gave him her full attention. "When Clara died," he said, his voice very even, very controlled, "I made a kind of agreement with myself, that I would manage what remained, that I would not ask for anything beyond what the land and the work could provide, because I had lost the thing I was asking for, and I did not know how to ask for less than that." Virginia said nothing, because he was not finished. "I had not intended," he said, "for anyone to sit on my fence rail. And when you did, I had not intended to come outside. And when I came outside, I had not intended to come back. And I have been coming back for 4 months, and I understand now that the agreement I made with myself in 1871 was made by a different man in a different grief, and that it has been renegotiated without my noticing, because of you." He stopped. He was looking at the table. Virginia felt the full weight of everything he had just given her, the cost of it, the precision of it, the fact that he had clearly composed these sentences carefully and was delivering them with all the steadiness he possessed, and that the steadiness was genuine, but it was also work. "Owen," she said. He looked up. "I sat on that fence rail," she said, "because I was lonely and the evening light was beautiful, and then I kept sitting on it because of you. I had not intended to fall in love with someone who leaned against fence posts and said very little and brought coffee without being asked, and yet here I am." A stillness came over his face, and then something moved in it that she had not seen before, not the grief moving, but something else, something that had been behind the grief, something that was fully alive and fully present and looking at her with an intensity that made her catch her breath. "Virginia," he said. "Yes," she said, because the question in her name was clear. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, his large, work-scarred, careful hand, and the warmth of it was the most complete warmth she had ever felt. And they sat like that in the light of the lamp in the small farmhouse at the western edge of Caldera for a long time without saying anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying at that particular moment, everything essential having been said. The weeks that followed were a new territory for both of them, navigated with the care of people who understand that new territory requires attention and cannot be treated as though it is already mapped. Owen came to the fence rail still, because the habit was established and neither of them wanted to break it. But Virginia also came inside the gate now, and they walked the property together sometimes. And sometimes she sat in the front room of the farmhouse while he worked at the table, and sometimes he came into town on days other than Thursday and walked with her through Caldera's short main street in a manner that was noticed and commented upon by every person they passed. Though Caldera was not a malicious town, and the comments were more of the warmly curious variety than any other kind. "Mrs. Prout said when Virginia told her about the supper and what had been said at it, 'I am very glad,' with a simplicity and a sincerity that made Virginia's eyes sting. 'Are you surprised?' Virginia asked. 'Not in the least,' Mrs. Prout said. 'A woman does not walk to the same fence rail for 3 months without a reason.' 'I told myself I liked the light,' Virginia said. 'Of course you did,' Mrs. Prout said and smiled into her coffee. Judge Harmon arrived in Caldera in March, as he had said he would, and the review of Doyle Fitch's land transactions occupied 3 days and resulted in findings that the judge found sufficiently troubling to bring before the district court. Fitch, who had apparently not expected anyone to push back with any legal mechanism, departed Caldera with notable haste on the 2nd day of the review, and the transactions he had conducted were subsequently voided. And while the Larkin family and the other homesteaders who had sold could not fully undo what had been done, there were reparations of a sort, and the land that could be recovered was recovered. Owen had testified at the review calmly and precisely, and Virginia had sat in the back of the room at the town hall and watched him, and thought that there was a specific kind of attractiveness that belongs to a man who does a right thing without any performance of it, and that Owen Talbot possessed this quality in abundance. April came and the garden went in, and Virginia helped him plant the sweet peas along the fence because she knew how to do it, and because her hands in the garden soil alongside his felt like an expression of something she could not say more directly. The tomatoes and the beans and the herbs went in their orderly rows, and by May the garden was growing with a vigor that was deeply satisfying to both of them, and the sweet peas, when they bloomed in June, were the deep pink and purple of something remembered with full affection rather than sorrow. They had not talked about the future with any directness. This was not evasion on either of their parts. It was, rather, the particular way of people who have both been hurt by counting too heavily on futures that did not come to pass. They had the present, which was good and real and full, and they trusted it carefully and completely, and both of them understood that there was a question forthcoming that would need to be asked and answered, and both of them knew more or less when it would be asked. It was asked in June, on an evening when the sweet peas were in full bloom, and the evening light was everything Virginia had first sat on the fence rail to see, that amber and gold that was particular to this field, this landscape, this longitude in this season, and she was sitting on the rail as she had on that first evening in October, and Owen was standing at the fence post, as he had begun to stand there in November. And the months between had become the life of both of them in a way that neither had anticipated and neither would undo. Owen said, "I want to ask you to marry me." He did not dress it up. He was not a man who dressed things up. He said it with the directness he brought to everything, and his eyes were on her with that full, unguarded attention that she had learned to receive without looking away. "I want to ask you," he said, slightly more carefully, "because I want to be sure the asking is what you want, not just the answer. I understand that you came here alone and made yourself a life alone, and that this was not an accidental arrangement. I understand that what I am asking is not a small thing." Virginia felt the full weight of him, this careful, precise, deeply careful man who had thought about her specific situation and the nature of her independence, and was asking rather than assuming, understanding that the architecture of what she had built for herself here had value and that love is not a wrecking ball and should not be. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said, the same way she had said it at the supper table in February, because the question in her name was clear and he understood it. "I would like to be asked," she said, "and the answer is yes." The look on his face was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life, not the dramatic face of a man in a story, not tears and declarations, but a full and genuine relief, as though something that had been wound very tightly for a very long time had been very slowly released, and behind the relief something else, something warm and alive and entirely his, something she now knew was meant for her. He reached over the fence rail and took her hand, and they stayed at the fence rail as the sun went down, and the field turned golden in the last of the light, and the cattle made their unhurried passage through the grass, and the sweet peas moved against the fence in a small warm wind, and neither of them was alone anymore, in the way that matters most. They married in July of 1875 in the church in Caldera, which was small and clean, and had morning light that came in at an angle through the two west-facing windows and made patterns on the plank floor. There was nothing elaborate about it. Virginia wore a dress she had made herself from good blue calico, with a white collar and cuffs, and she thought it was among the best work she had done, which seemed appropriate. Owen wore his good shirt and his good hat, and his expression throughout the ceremony was the expression of a man who is being fully present at something important, which was the only way he knew how to be present at anything. Mrs. Prout was there and wept in the quiet, contained way of a woman who has learned to manage strong feeling, and Amos Briggs was there and shook Owen's hand 3 times, once for the ceremony, once because he seemed to feel it was warranted, and once because he clearly could not think of anything else to do with the emotion. Judge Harmon, who happened to be passing through Caldera on other business, attended the small reception afterward at Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house, which was generous and a little surreal, and he made a toast that was both brief and genuinely kind. Owen had spent the weeks before the wedding adding a proper second room to the farmhouse, not a large addition, but enough to make the space a true home rather than a working shelter, with a proper floor and a window that faced south over the garden. He had done most of the work himself, with help from the Jessup boy, and from a man named Cal Martinez who had come up from the south the previous year and settled a small property half a mile away, and had become, over the winter, something approaching a neighbor in the fuller sense of the word. Cal Martinez was a man of about 40 with a calm and competent manner, and a dry sense of humor that Owen responded to with genuine warmth, which was to say he smiled more in Cal's company than in most people's. Virginia moved into the farmhouse on the day they married, and she understood immediately and completely that this was where she was meant to be, not in the sense of fate or mystical design, but in the plain practical sense that the space fit her and she fit it, and the work of making a home of it was already partly done, and the rest of it was something she was genuinely glad to undertake. She kept her work for Amos Briggs for the time being, coming into town 3 days a week, because the income was useful, and because she was good at the work, and because she was not a woman who gave up useful competencies on account of changed circumstances. Owen had not suggested she should, because he was not that kind of man, which she had known, but which it was still satisfying to verify in the actual circumstances. The late summer and fall of 1875 passed in a way that Virginia would later describe to herself as the kind of ordinary that is so full it cannot be called ordinary at all. They worked the cattle and tended the garden and put up preserves for the winter and went to town on Thursdays together instead of separately, and in the evenings they sat on the porch that faced east when the weather permitted, or at the kitchen table when it did not, and talked about the day's particulars and the world's larger particulars, and sometimes about things that had no category, and Owen read to her sometimes from the Shakespeare, which she had not expected but which she loved. And she read to him, sometimes from a novel she had acquired from the library in Holt Fork on the occasion of one of Owen's trips there, and the reading aloud quality of those evenings was one of the pleasures she had not anticipated, and that turned out to be essential. He still was not a man of many words in the general way of things. He still came to the fence rail sometimes, or she found him there, standing at the post at the end of a long day in the way he had always stood there, looking at the field, and she came and stood beside him or sat on the rail, and they were quiet together in the way they had always been quiet together, and the silence was the same good silence it had always been, full rather than empty. The silence of two people who do not need to fill the space between them, because the space between them is itself a form of companionship. By the following spring, in 1876, Virginia was expecting their first child. She told Owen on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting on the fence rail in the early light of the year, and his face did a thing she had seen only once before on the day they were married, this full, unguarded release of feeling, this warmth that was not performed but could not be hidden. "When?" he said. "September," she said, "or near to it." He sat on the rail beside her, which he did not always do. He usually stood at the post, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him in the way she had learned she fit against him, and the field was green and alive with the new growth of spring, and the sweet peas they had planted again this year were already showing their first pale shoots along the garden fence. And the world was complete in a way that Virginia had not believed the world could be when she had arrived on the stage from El Paso 18 months before, alone and practical, and carefully, not hoping for too much. The summer of 1876 was a full and complicated season. The garden was the best it had been since Owen could remember. He said this was because of the way Virginia had amended the soil in the south bed, though she thought it was more likely the late winter rains that had been unusually generous. And they put up more preserves than they had storage space for, and had to build an additional shelf in the root cellar, which Owen did on a hot August afternoon while Virginia, by this point considerably and gloriously round with the baby, sat on an upturned bucket and handed him the tools and provided what she called supervision and he called interference, with the slight wry quality that she loved. Cal Martinez came by that afternoon to return a tool he had borrowed, and found them in the root cellar in this configuration, and laughed until he had to sit down, which was the appropriate response. Their son was born on the 17th of September, 1876. He was a large, loud, thoroughly healthy boy with dark hair and Owen's jaw and Virginia's green eyes, which was a combination that Mrs. Prout, who came to help with the birth and its immediate aftermath in the capable no-nonsense manner of a woman who had delivered several babies in frontier circumstances, described as utterly unfair to the rest of the world. They named him Thomas Henry Talbot Thomas for Virginia's father and Henry, because Owen had a grandfather named Henry, who had homesteaded this part of Texas before the war and whose land had eventually become Owen's, and who deserved to be remembered. Owen held Thomas for the first time with the particular careful steadiness of a man who understands he is holding something irreplaceable, and the expression on his face was one that Virginia would return to in memory for the rest of her days. This man who had been so long alone in his grief, holding his son in the farmhouse he had built at the edge of the world, with the evening light coming in through the south window over the garden, and the sweet peas still blooming outside in the September warmth. Impossibly, beautifully late in the season. "Hello," Owen said to Thomas very quietly. Thomas looked up at him with the unfocused, profound attention of a newborn, which is both completely without content and somehow entirely sincere. "He knows your voice," Virginia said from the bed. Owen looked at her. "Does he?" "Babies know the voices they have been hearing," she said. "He has been hearing yours for 6 months." Owen looked back at Thomas with an expression that she could not find a single word for, but that was made of several things simultaneously: love and wonder, and the specific tenderness of a man who has learned that joy and grief are not opposites, but are in fact intimately related, each making the other possible, each giving the other its full weight. "Thomas," Owen said, "we are going to get along." Thomas made a small, unimpressed sound that was either agreement or dissatisfaction and fell asleep, and Owen sat in the chair beside the bed and did not put Thomas down for a very long time. The months after Thomas arrived reshaped their life in the expected ways and also in unexpected ones. Owen, who had been a man of solitary habit for so long that the habits had become a kind of second skin, adapted to fatherhood with a thoroughness that Virginia found both touching and slightly amazing to witness. He was not effusive, he was Owen. He was constitutionally incapable of effusion, but he was present in the most complete sense of the word, attentive and reliable, and clearly taken with his son in the deep, quiet way he was taken with things he cared about deeply. He built Thomas a proper cradle from cedar, sanded smooth and fitted with real joinery, and he sang to Thomas in the evenings. Virginia had not known he could sing, because he had not done it where she could hear him before Thomas arrived. Simple old songs, hymns and work songs, and one or two that sounded like they might have been half remembered from his own childhood, delivered in a low, even voice with no self-consciousness at all, because Thomas did not require performance and Owen knew it. Virginia recovered from the birth with the practical speed of a young and healthy woman who does not permit herself to linger in recovery longer than necessary, and was back to her sewing work for Amos Briggs within 6 weeks, though on a reduced schedule, and back to the fence rail evenings within the same time frame, sometimes with Thomas in her arms, which added a new element to the tableau that she thought Clara would have liked, if Clara was somewhere that allowed for such observations. Virginia had developed a complex and affectionate relationship with Clara's memory, not jealousy, which would have been both ungenerous and irrational, but something more like gratitude. For this woman she had never met who had planted the sweet peas and started the garden, and loved this man well enough that his grief at her loss was the measure of something worth measuring. The winter of 1876 into 1877 was cold and long but not brutal, and they managed it with the accumulated knowledge of a household that had been well supplied and well prepared, the root cellar full of preserves and dried vegetables, and the woodpile stacked high on the south side of the house, and the cattle fat from a good summer of grazing. Thomas grew at the rate that healthy babies grow, which is to say with an enthusiasm that makes you feel the weeks have been stolen from you, and by Christmas he was sitting up and interested in everything in his field of vision, and Owen had made him a wooden horse to hold, smooth and simple, fitted to a small hand. Cal Martinez came for Christmas supper that year, because Cal's wife had died in childbirth back in New Mexico several years prior, which was a grief Cal carried with the same contained steadiness that Owen carried his, and Virginia had long since decided that the Talbot table was large enough for people who carried their griefs well. Mrs. Pruitt also came, and Amos Briggs and his wife Luella, who was a cheerful woman with a laugh like a bell, and the farmhouse was full in a way that it had not been full before in Owen's time there, and he looked around the table at one point with an expression Virginia caught across the candlelight. This quiet, full, almost surprised gratitude, the expression of a man who had not expected to find himself here and was not taking it for granted. She caught his eye and he held it, and between them in that glance was the entire story of the fence rail and the coffee and the November evening when he had first come outside and said that cattle do not need watching, and the February afternoon when he had said he had found himself thinking he would tell her about it when he returned, and the June evening at the gate, and the July morning in the church with the light on the floor, and the September evening with Thomas in his arms. All of it in a glance, between two people who had learned to say large things in small languages. She smiled at him. He smiled back, which was still a thing she collected carefully each time it happened, because it was rare and therefore precious. "Merry Christmas," she said quietly. "Merry Christmas," he said. The new year of 1877 came in quietly, and with it a spring full of planting and cattle and the ordinary particular work of their life, and in the summer Virginia began to suspect that she was expecting again, which turned out to be correct, and she told Owen on a morning in August while they were picking tomatoes in the garden. She had thought the fence rail was the right place for this kind of news, it being where so much of their story had happened. But the morning was fine and the tomatoes were ripe and she could not wait. Again, Owen said, with a delight he was not entirely successful at containing. Again, Virginia said. Thomas, who was not quite a year old and was sitting on a blanket at the edge of the garden with a wooden spoon and an appropriate level of focus, looked up at the sound of his father's voice. "Do you hear that?" Owen said to Thomas, who looked at him with the specific expression of a small child who is listening attentively to something he cannot yet decode. "You are going to be a brother." Thomas said something that was not a word but was clearly his opinion on the matter. "He is enthusiastic," Virginia said. "He does not know yet what it means," Owen said. "Neither do we," Virginia pointed out. "We only have the one." Owen laughed, which was the best sound, and Thomas laughed too in response to his father's laugh, which was a development in Thomas's repertoire that was only a few weeks old and still produced in both his parents a joy that was entirely disproportionate to its cause and entirely appropriate to it. The second child, a daughter they named Clara for the obvious reason. Rose because Virginia had always loved roses, and because the May morning the name was decided upon had smelled like the small wild roses that grew along the creek, and also because it sounded right alongside Clara and felt, to both of them, like a tribute that was given freely, and with full love was born in April of 1878, and she arrived quickly and with great purpose, in the manner of someone who has already made up her mind about most things. Clara Rose Talbot had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and a disposition that was from the very beginning entirely her own, which is to say confident and curious, and not easily deterred, which Owen observed with an admiration he did not bother to hide in Thomas, now 18 months old, regarded with the deeply ambivalent expression of a firstborn encountering the reality of the situation. "He is not sure about her," Owen said, watching Thomas observe his sister with a toddler's combination of interest and territorial suspicion. "He will come around," Virginia said, with the confidence of a woman who has read Thomas Talbot correctly from the beginning. Thomas did come around. By summer he was bringing Clara Rose objects he considered important: the wooden horse, smooth river stones, a particularly fine stick, and placing them within her reach with an air of generosity that was both genuine and self-congratulatory. And Owen watched this and felt something in his chest that was so full it was difficult to contain, and did not try to. The years moved in their good and particular way. The land gave back what was put into it, as land does when it is worked with knowledge and care. The cattle herd grew slowly, and then less slowly, as the market for beef moved with the railroads that were pushing west, and Owen made decisions about the herd with his characteristic precision, selling when the price was right and holding when it was not, and reading the patterns of weather and market and land with the deep accumulated competence of a man who has done this for a long time and paid attention the whole while. Virginia kept her work with Amos Briggs through 1878, and then, when Clara Rose was walking and Thomas was into everything, and the house required more constant attention, she reduced the work to occasional pieces rather than regular days, and Briggs was understanding about it in the way that good employers in small towns are understanding, which is to say he grumbled about it exactly enough to make clear he would miss the work, and not at all enough to make her feel guilty about it. The fence rail was still there, weathered now in the way of things that have been in the weather for a long time and are none the worse for it. Virginia still sat on it sometimes in the evenings, because some habits are not habits but are essential practices, and Owen still came to the post, and sometimes Thomas came and sat on the lower rail and looked at the cattle with the early version of his father's thoughtful attention, and sometimes Clara Rose came and demanded to be lifted onto the top rail beside her mother, which Virginia did with the automatic ease of a woman accustomed to managing a small person's logistics. On one such evening, in the fall of 1879, Thomas, who was almost 3½ and had been adding to his vocabulary with a speed that was gratifying and also occasionally problematic, pointed at the field and said with absolute seriousness, "Papa's cows." "Yes," Owen said, "those are the cattle." "Papa's," Thomas said again with the emphasis of someone establishing a point. "Ours," Virginia corrected mildly. Thomas looked at her with the expression of someone being politely disagreed with by someone he loves. "Ours," he revised, and then with a generous addition, "and Clara Rose's." Clara Rose, not quite two, said something that was probably meant to be her own name, and was recognizable as such by people who knew her. Owen looked at Virginia over the children's heads in the amber October light, and she looked back at him, and the fence rail and the field and the sweet-smelling evening air and these two small people between them were the complete world, entirely sufficient, entirely whole. She would tell him later, inside, after the children were asleep, about the new life she suspected was beginning again, the third, who would arrive in the early summer of 1880 and would be a boy they would name James Cal Talbot, the Cal being for Cal Martinez, who had by 1880 become as close to family as a man without blood relation could be, and who would stand straight and obviously moved at the naming and say, in his characteristically dry way, "It is a better name than the name for a mule," which was his reference to Monday and Tuesday, and which made Owen laugh in the way that only Cal and Virginia could reliably make him laugh. But that was still ahead of them. On this October evening in 1879, they were all four at the fence rail together, and the light was exactly what it had always been, particular and amber and unrepeatable. And Owen put his arm around Virginia's shoulders, and she leaned into him, and Thomas leaned against his father's leg, and Clara Rose held onto her mother's arm, and the cattle moved through the grass in the golden evening, and the world was large and the fence was solid, and the lives built here were genuinely, durably good. There was a moment, in all of this, that Virginia returned to sometimes when she was being reflective. The moment on that first October evening, alone at the fence rail, before any of it had happened, before Owen had come outside, before the coffee and the conversations and the supper and the gate and the church and all the seasons of all the years. The moment when she had sat down on the rail and looked at the field and felt, for the first time since arriving in Caldera, something that was not quite contentment but was adjacent to it. She had not known then what she was adjacent to. She had not known that the stillness she felt was not merely the absence of agitation, but the presence of something specific, the presence of the right place, the right light, the right field with the right man somewhere inside it, not yet outside, not yet at the fence, but there real, the fixed point around which everything else would eventually orient itself. She had sat on the rail and looked at the evening and known nothing of this. And she had come back the next evening, and the next, and the pattern had established itself with the ease of something that had always been true and was only now being discovered. He had not asked for company in years. She had sat on the fence rail outside his field every evening and he had never told her to go. That was all. That had been, it turned out, entirely sufficient. In the spring of 1880, when the sweet peas were going in for the 6th year running along the garden fence, Owen stood beside Virginia in the turned soil, and she pressed the seeds in with her thumb the way she had learned from her mother, and he covered them with earth the way Clara had taught him, and the two methods were not the same but they both worked, which was the point. Thomas wants to help plant, Virginia said. He pulls everything up to see if it has grown yet, Owen said. He is curious, Virginia said with a mother's absolute loyalty. He is destructive, Owen said with a father's absolute accuracy. Both, Virginia said. Both, Owen agreed and smiled. The sweet peas grew, they always grew. The garden was established in its knowledge, the soil improved each year, the hands that worked it experienced and willing. By June the peas were blooming in their deep pinks and purples, and the tomatoes were setting fruit, and James Cal Talbot was born on the 18th of June in the back room of the farmhouse, while Thomas and Clara Rose were temporarily lodged with Mrs. Prout, who managed this arrangement with her characteristic competence, and who returned them the following day slightly oversugared, but otherwise intact. James was small and quiet, and looked at the world from the beginning with an expression of unhurried assessment that Virginia recognized, because she had seen it on Owen's face for 5 years. Owen looked at this third child and felt the same thing he had felt at the arrival of the first, which is to say the full weight of something irreplaceable held carefully in his hands. He has your way of looking, Virginia said. I hope not, Owen said. It takes a long time to warm up that way. It is worth the wait, Virginia said, looking at him with a directness that made clear she was not only talking about the baby. Owen met her eyes and held them, and everything that had ever been said between them at a fence post or a supper table or a church door or in the quiet of the evenings was there in the look, accumulated and real. Yes, he said, it is. By the fall of 1880, the Talbot homestead had expanded to include a second barn, a proper root cellar with a timber-framed entrance instead of the rough-dug original, a chicken house that Thomas had helped paint in the summer, the painting process having been more thorough than precise, resulting in a quantity of yellow paint on Thomas that suggested he had approached the project from the inside, and a small second garden plot that Virginia had put in for cutting flowers, not vegetables. because the sweet peas had reminded her that not everything in a garden has to be productive in the literal sense, and she had finally claimed this truth entirely for herself. Cal Martinez had expanded his own operation by this time and taken on a hired hand, a young man from San Antonio named Rodrigo, who was learning the cattle work with Cal's characteristic quiet thoroughness as teacher. And the friendship between the Talbot household and Cal Martinez was one of those friendships that functions as a form of family, a steady, reliable presence that asks for nothing extraordinary and provides something that turns out to be essential. Mrs. Prout remained in her boarding house and remained Virginia's closest friend in the way that the first person to see you clearly in a new place tends to remain important. They took tea together on Fridays when Virginia was in town and talked about the town's news and the children's development, and occasionally about larger matters. And Mrs. Prout watched Virginia's life with the satisfaction of a woman who has been proven right about something that mattered. Amos Briggs sold the dry goods store in 1881 to a younger man from San Antonio, and retired with his wife Lawella to a small house at the east end of town where he grew tomatoes and complained pleasantly about the heat. The new owner of the store retained Virginia's occasional mending work because her stitches remained small and even and she was still the best seamstress in the immediate territory, and because she was Virginia Talbot, and that counted for something in Caldera, which was a town that knew its own. Owen, in the fall of 1881, turned 38 years old, which Virginia marked by making him a cake with molasses and dried fruit that was not a birthday tradition in his experience, but that she had decided to institute because she was the kind of person who believed in marking the passage of years with something made with your hands and given with intention. He accepted this with a bemused grace that had become one of her favorite expressions of his. "What is the occasion?" he asked, looking at the cake. "Your birthday," she said. "You did not do this last year," he said. "I was busy with James," she said. "I am making up for it." He looked at her for a moment with the full, direct attention that had not diminished in 7 years. "Virginia," he said. "Owen," she said, in the way she always said his name when he said hers like that, which was a private language they had developed for this exact exchange, meaning I am here and I see you and all of this is real and I am glad. "The cake is very good," he said. "I know," she said. Thomas, who was 5 now and had his mother's ability to be direct about things, said, "Can I have some?" "After supper," Virginia and Owen said together, which made Thomas roll his eyes with a 5-year-old's theatrical timing, and Clara Rose, who was 3½ and regarded her brother as the primary authority on most matters, rolled her eyes identically, and James, who was 14 months and understood nothing of this but recognized the mood, made a sound of cheerful general agreement. The evening ended with cake and the children in their beds and the house quiet and Owen and Virginia on the east-facing porch in the fall air, and the sky above them was the enormous sky of the Texas plains, salted with stars, the Milky Way pouring across it in the way it pours across dark country skies, broad and excessive and humbling. They had sat on this porch hundreds of evenings. They would sit on it hundreds more. "What are you thinking?" Virginia asked, which was a question she allowed herself occasionally, knowing he would answer it honestly or not at all. "That it is a good life," Owen said. "That I did not expect it." "Neither did I," she said. "I am glad," he said, "that you sat on my fence." She looked at him. The stars were reflected in his eyes, or she imagined they were, which came to the same thing. "I am glad you did not tell me to go," she said. He shook his head slightly, the small motion of a man rejecting a suggestion that is self-evidently wrong. "That was never a possibility," he said. "From the first evening. You stood in the barn door for 10 minutes, she said. I was deciding whether I was the kind of man who could stand in the barn door for 10 minutes and not say anything, he said. It turned out I was. She laughed, soft and genuine, and he watched her laugh with the open appreciation of a man who has been watching the person he loves for years, and has not grown accustomed to it in the way that would reduce it, but has grown accustomed to it in the way that makes it larger, deeper, more essential with every passing year. "What are you thinking?" he asked, turning it back to her. She looked out at the dark field, at the fence line that was a shadow in the starlight, at the place where the fence rail would be in the morning, where it had always been. "I am thinking," Virginia Talbot said, "that it is a good thing I like the light." Owen put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the night settled around the farmhouse and the field and the fence, and the stars moved in their ancient arcs overhead, and the children slept in their beds, and the sweet peas, long past their season, had left their seeds in the soil for the following spring, and everything was exactly what it had grown to be: complete, closed, full, and real.